Um, so just a little bit about who pays me to exist. Diversity and Ability is where I'm from. You may have encountered us in the university sector before, but we're an award-winning disabled-led social enterprise. And what that means is we're driven by authentic lived experience. So I myself identify as disabled with a whole host of wonderful conditions and medications and fun times associated with it. But generally, we are by and for disabled people. So 85% plus of our entire workforce at DNA identifies deaf, disabled, or neurodiverse. So truly, we are led by disabled people. So that's where the talk is coming from today. And we work to create diverse and inclusive cultures within institutions, higher education, workplace, your local corner shop, everything. We want to change society for social good, as it were. So sharing quite a lot of similarities with Blackbullion as well from the talks we've had together, all about improving things for everyone. So who am I specifically to be able to give this talk to you today? Well, I am Piers Wilkinson. I do use they, them pronouns, but I'm not militant about it at all. So don't worry if you ever mess it up at all. I am the Senior Policy and Campaigns Lead at DNA, at least for the next week or two, till I get a new title, which should change, but it's all good. Some of you may have encountered my work as the Student Voice Commissioner on the Disabled Students Commission, which was set up by the Office for Students, or now in the Disabled Student Commitment Group in their Policy and Liaison Support Team. That's working to create a commitment for change in the higher education sector. If you haven't checked it out, if you scan this QR code here, it will give you a bunch of links to the Disabled Student Commitment. You don't have to do it now, you can do it at the end of the talk. But I also sit on the NADP, the National Association of Disability Practitioners Board of Directors. So fancy titles, fun commissionerships aside, what it effectively means is I am a disabled person that uses my authentic lived experience with my sector specialty and expertise to support people in building and knowing how to make things more inclusive for disabled students, disabled staff, and disabled people in wider society. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, say, what sort of role you're from, what sort of institution you're from, or more generally, if you're just here for the sort of wider sector vibes, then that's also fantastic. Helps me get a feeling of who's in the audience. So welcome. So what we're talking about today is, if I don't double click, we're going to look at the financial picture for disabled students at a glance. We're going in the Disabled Students Allowance overview and other types of support available. Don't worry if you've not encountered the Disabled Students Allowance before, I'll talk it through. We're going to focus much on inclusive practice because I'm a very strong believer in people being able to leave with things they can do tomorrow, do in 6 weeks, or in a year's time, tangibly, no matter what your role is. We're then going to potentially, if we have time, look at some of the recent sector developments, but there's a lot of information there. So when the slides come round, you can look at those and learn from them. I filled the slide notes with a bunch of information and links for your future reference. So there's some additional reading, as it were, if this was a lecture, for you to engage with at your leisure or refer back to. Similarly, a lot of the slide notes are written in a way that will have hyperlinks or contextual information to refer back to after this session or when you're reviewing the recording. Then we'll get into grilling me like a fish, which is always my favourite activity as I was a physical oceanographer in my time at university. So the financial picture of being disabled in higher education, but more widely as well, I think is important to look at because being disabled can be incredibly expensive. The headline figures, I think, is something that we should have in our mind for the context of why talking about disability in higher education is important, besides the moral, EDI, and ethical reasons. It is that as of 2023, UCAS reported the highest number ever of students sharing a disability during the application process, up 33.8% from just last year. That is a huge increase in the number of disabled students, and it might be reflective of those that put off going to university during the pandemic. But it means that about 20% on average of your institution will comprise of disabled students in one form or another that have gone through UCAS at least. And therefore, a fifth of the population and understanding a fifth of the population of students is an imperative for you as staff, but also as champions of financial security and well-being within the sector. Nice to see a whole bunch of people from lots of different areas commenting in the chat. You know, everything from the money advisors and everything like that. But for those that haven't talked with disability services or don't know the proportional makeup of disabled students in terms of what you might think of as HESA category, the two largest groups are mental health challenges. That comes under the whole remit of anxiety to depression to the more chronic and critical mental health challenges like psychosis, BPD, borderline personality disorder, and other ones like that, all the way to specific learning differences, which is the other big component, which covers things like neurodiversity umbrella, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, all those sorts of specific learning differences. Those are the two largest, and as such, it's important when we talk about finances that those two are actually significant factors when it comes to financial well-being for disabled students. Is the barriers they face due to mental health or specific learning difference or neurodiversity directly impact their learning ability and skill set when it comes to financial management. Secondly, I just wanted to include a little thing here because it will make sense when we get to inclusive practice, which is to say only 7.9% of disabled students reported being aware of disability-specific careers advice. And that's from the Disabled Students Commission in 21. I have to write that report, so I'm technically quoting myself. I hope you forgive me. But I think it's important to say that you are all doing amazing work in your roles. But that doesn't necessarily mean disabled students are aware that A, they can use the service, or that there's a specific thread of service for them. And as we see with disability employment gaps, postgraduate outcomes, is that 92.1% of disabled students not aware of these types of services is critical in understanding how we can have all the money in the world, theoretically, available to support hardship, available to support students to engage in education, but awareness of what they are aware of is also critically important. And I just have a stat here about the cost of living, as it were, because I think that everyone is impacted by the cost of living at the moment. But it's important to recognise that disabled people are twice as likely to report struggling with affording household essentials, food, utilities, rent, the essentials of living. And that's not including the additional stresses and limitations of being a student. A lot of financial advice at university is about getting a part-time job. But if you're a disabled person like me as a wheelchair user, I couldn't get a part-time job in those student things because can't work behind a checkout, can't work in a warehouse, can't do deliveries, can't do a whole bunch of the studenty jobs that even universities offer because they just can't accommodate a disabled person with the challenges that I did, and similarly that applies across the board. So additional sources of income are an important facet when thinking about the impact of financial hardship and financial flexibility to be able to stabilise a declining situation. And then just on the intake understanding of disabled students, disabled people account for at least a third of the poorest households in the UK. Disability and poverty are connected, maybe not causal in terms of causal, there we go, that's the right word, but there is a very strong correlation between poverty and disability in the sector. Some specific numbers here. On average, according to Scope research in 23, so just this year, disabled households spend an additional £1,122 per month just on disability. So when we think about student loans, and the maximum, even with all of the additional type of support, being around about £11,500, or just over 11, I should say, that doesn't even cover just the extra cost of disability on average for a disabled person in the UK facing each month. And you may be thinking, where does this £1,122 comes from? Well, one, it's inclusive of all disability related social security. So if we remove that, it probably goes up to about 1,600, which is most people's salaries in a month. But these costs include specialist equipment, wheelchairs, as reported all the way back in 2014. The wheelchair service in the NHS is vastly not what people expect it to be. My wheelchair cost £6,000, and I got about a £250 voucher from the NHS towards the cost of it. That's why there is a significant rise in disabled students using platforms, fundraising platforms, to source funds for essential specialist equipment, from wheelchairs to home adaptation to everything from PA support, personal assistant support, to critical travel features and covers. There's also the additional services costs, such as having PAs in the first place. We have seen in the news in the recent years about local authorities being strapped for cash and reducing the amount available for direct payments for disabled people. So when we talk about that, that means that for the living aspect of disabled students' lives, they're paying more for less support. So there's additional costs there. And then there's the additional aspect of utilities are more expensive because we rely on more electricity and water usage. I take at least 25 minutes in the shower, and that's because I'm sat down. I can't do the spinny thing that all my friends talk about around the shower, where they circle under the shower so they can wash themselves easily. It takes longer to wash, it takes longer to cook, it takes longer to prep for things. It costs more. Also requires heating and those sorts of things. And then there is the additional aspect of accessible accommodation is less than 1% of the total available accommodation in the UK. In the private purpose-built student accommodation area, it's slightly higher, but it all comes with additional costs. They're newer builds, they're larger because of the space needed. They have almost always ensuite bathrooms for adapted reasons, so they cost more. Things that are expensive to be disabled. And then the rise in cost of living does impact everyone, and I'm not saying it to any other group that it doesn't have a significant impact, but it is the degree of impact that is important. So these costs, just 2022, were only around £900 a month. So in that single year, it increased by about £200. We will see a similar increase potentially for 2024 as well. So that's the terrifying bit of like how expensive it is to be disabled, along with potentially, hopefully, myth busting around why it's expensive to be disabled and where there are avenues of regress, as it were. Most people assume that the NHS will just provide disability specialist equipment for free. That is unfortunately no longer the case for at least the last 15, 16 years, alas. But it does help towards helping you understand a little bit of where some of the costs come from. But what is the support that is available? Well, first and foremost is Disabled Students Allowance. It's the government supported grant of up to £26,500 for students to access education in higher education. Unfortunately, it is very specific in that it provides support for education adjustments only, and adjustments that are specific to their course contact hours. If you have a guest lecture, you're not getting travel for that. If you have a guest lecture, you're not getting BSL support or any other types of interpretation support if it's outside your usual contact hours. So a lot of people think DSA is the one-stop shop, but it's not. It is very specific for the support that it is targeted towards. We then have student loans, which I think was just talked about in terms of emailing around. Student loans are a critical resource for a lot of disabled students, given that they come from the poorer backgrounds. But Additionally, there is a special support top-up of the loan. It used to be a grant back in 2014, 15, 16, before it changed to a loan of up to £4,327. Now, this means that if you have a higher income from your parents, you can apply for an additional top-up as a result of disability and additional costs. But as we see, that doesn't even cover 4 months' worth of additional costs according to the scope report. So while student loans are a critical financial resource, there is an aspect to it that can support disabled students, but it isn't the same as receiving all types of support. As I've mentioned previously, local authorities have direct payments for PAs, personal assistants, but we also have personal independence payments, and before that, disability living allowance if they're on the legacy. There is also carers allowance, which for those that have seen it before, it pays less than minimum wage. And I do mean it's significantly less. Some carers on carers allowance earn about £1.50 per hour of care that they provide. So when we talk about the types of finances available for disabled people in the UK for students at university, Social Security isn't the first port of call for critical financial issues when it comes to disability. Additionally, we used to be eligible for universal credit, but in the last couple of years, the government changed the policy, lost the court case, then changed the law, so that unless you were already receiving universal credit for another reason, you can't now receive universal credit as a disabled student for the sake of disability alone. Then there are hardship funding and scholarships, which you will know about way more than me, but it's important to note that a lot of these areas of support are very specific and niche around how you access them or what level of threshold you go to. Some can be academic excellence. I got one of those in my time for scholarship. Others were because of the first coming to university for the first time. But it's important to know you have to be aware of scholarships to apply for scholarships, and you have to be aware of hardship funding and how to access it to be able to access it. So before we move on to some of the issues around the areas that I've just talked about, and some things for you to be aware of, I did want to say the DSA process can be summed up in students applying, students being assessed via needs assessment, students receiving confirmation of their support from the student loans company, and then them taking up the support. There's a lot to deal with this, but handily, at DNA, we've produced a user-led guide that is recently updated and it's completely free to the point that even UCAS signpost to it on their website to our guide. So that link is there for everyone. If you're unsure of the DSA process, you want to learn about it for yourself, dive straight in. And if you want to signpost it to students, we fully endorse you sharing that resource as widely as possible. So I've already touched on some of these, but something to be aware of in recent years is the flexibility for disabled students, even if they have all of the financial resource behind them that they're able to be eligible for. That is, there's a lack of control around the choice of supplier and the provider. So with access to work, it's been narrowed down to 2 or 3 providers. For DSA, it has recently been narrowed down, and that's in the further reading, around to 2 suppliers for assistive technology needs assessment and equipment supply. And the routes of complaint are quite arduous. So being financial advisors, being financial well-being professionals or working closely with disability services, you may find yourself having to navigate these complexities with your students to ensure that they're getting the support that they're meant to be getting. Especially support challenges, this is in reference to, yes, mental health and SPLD are the highest incidence in terms of disability type, but VI, visual impairment, hard of hearing, blind and deaf students have disproportionately high costs associated with them. And that is because of interpretation and equipment. And that is to say that, yes, there are a lot of charities that have existed that provided that interim support. But anyone that's been paying attention to the Thomas Pocklington Trust, the Snowden Trust, the RNID, the RNIB, will notice that a lot of them are struggling or going under in terms of the amount of funding they had available for students. Course-specific challenges. Now, this is to say that DSA does not take into account, and do the local authority funding for PAs, what your course does. It's not there to provide support for your course, and even DSA doesn't provide course-specific support. So as someone that did a modelling course in terms of physical oceanography, that meant that when we were talking about having a laptop that could have all of my assistive technology, but also run all of the software, it wasn't able to do it, and I had to go through a hardship grant to get a computer that was powerful enough to do my course, but also host all of my assistive technology. So it's important that when we talk about the course-specific challenges and disability, equipment costs, which are usually assumed to be the responsibility of the student, not always be assessed to be the student's responsibility if DSA is dropping the ball, as it were. Funding caps, I've mentioned already. The administrative burden is the fact that it can take a part-time job of time to apply for all of these. And I've mentioned the impact of mental health and neurodiversity has on the ability to access. And the level of quality is hit or miss. It's a postcode lottery depending on the institution you go to. And students are saying that the difference between courses, in particular, in the same institution can widely vary. So ensuring that there's a joined-up approach is critical to ensuring the financial security of students to be able to focus on their education, but also ensuring that any support that's put in place isn't exacerbating the additional challenges that they might face. But long story short, inclusive practice, that's what you're here for. I just want to start with a quote from me, because I've always got asked to provide this quote, and that is, nobody wants to be reasonably adjusted, they just want to be welcome. The best inclusive practice I can convey to anyone today is taking the approach of talking to disabled students like they're human beings. Now, that doesn't sound like a big thing, but it's important to note that the awkwardness, the shyness around disability and communicating with disabled people, to focus immediately on disability over the person, create a community of not being welcomed or feeling like they belong. So asking, hi, how are you, as the first port of call, and asking, how can I help you, if you're asking about adjustment. Phrasing it in that way, you're addressing that person as an individual rather than their disability. Avoiding language like, we have a wheelchair user to adapt and provide support. Use people's names, engage with them in a way that creates that sense of belonging. They're more likely to come to you for avenues of support. They're more likely to be honest with you when discussing some of their challenges and heading off some of the issues later on down the line. In terms of the principles, it's about sailing the 4 seas, about providing certainty to students, about providing consistency to students, about providing communication to students in terms of using a sense of 2 senses, and it's about giving students choice at the heart of everything that we do. Choice of how to engage, choice of adjustment, choice of how they want to provide evidence, choice of how to engage in your service in the first place. These little practical steps are know your signposting. As we mentioned right at the start, only 7.9% of disabled students are aware of disability-specific careers advice. But knowing how to signpost to signpost to, but importantly, using a named member of staff is critical for signposting. The number of times that you will recommend a student contact disability services, library services, the wellbeing services, or any other, not providing a name means that they're unlikely to follow through with reaching out because they don't know who's in that team. Saying, contact Jamie in disability services and he'll help you right away. Contact Sarah and Deborah in the financial wellbeing team. They'll love to help you. Contact Richard over in the department and he'll happily talk with you about being a disability champion. Having that personality behind signposting means students are far more likely to complete the step and active support. Ask the question, what can we do to make this more accessible? If it's in your meeting, do it. Right at the end, when you've gone through everything that's completely irrelevant to disabled students, apparently, just ask out loud in that meeting, just quickly, is there anything we can do with what we've just discussed to make things more accessible? Is it communicating what you've talked about so that students feel like they are at least able to engage in the process of decision making? Is it about ensuring that the documents you provide, you click the check accessibility button on Word? What can you do in 6 months to a year is reevaluate criteria. Can the criteria for hardship funds or other support inadvertently penalise disabled students? Just a sec, I'm going to close my window. Terribly sorry, I'm trying to minimise the noise, and that is Sod's law. But unfortunately, a lot of hardship funding criteria um, takes away from some of the challenges that they shouldn't face. And in that, I mean, when the price of a phone bill can sometimes be higher because you're always on hold to the Department for Work and Pensions, unfortunately. Just yesterday, I was on hold for an hour and a half, which meant that I was using up my minutes like hell on my phone. Similarly, there's lots of other areas around utilities and the cap that we do on hardship funding that tries to make sure that students aren't spending too much on travel, on food, on eating out. Being unaware that a lot of disabled students require deliveries because they're having a flare-up in their condition, paying for taxis because DSA screwed up or because they are facing troubles getting to and from hospital appointments or accessing public transport. So ensuring that your hardship fund criteria and the way in which we set up scholarship criteria and others are complementary to the challenges that STEM students face is critical in what you can do over the next 12 months. And then finally, it's about the two senses approach to communication. This is something from building design, and I wanted to talk about it because it's about building redundancy into how we communicate. So it's ensuring that not just visual information is provided. In that regard, I mean, how do I contact you as a professional or your service? Is the information only available on the university website? If so, someone encountering digital accessibility challenges can't access the information to tell you they're struggling to access your information. So building that two senses principle where it can be auditory and visual, it can be tactile and visual or tactile and auditory, and ensuring that there are multiple ways for someone to get into contact. There are multiple ways for them to access the critical information that will ensure that they can take the steps necessary to be independent, to be financially secure, to seek help before it reaches a critical point where we know that intervention becomes more significant, more costly, and less impactful in the long run. DSA reform, just quickly, if I've got 3 minutes, that is to say that DSA has been undergoing reform for 5 years. It should have been in place October of 2020, but we know how the government works. It's very slow. It's actually February of this year. What's important is that incoming students will have very little awareness of the new system. Disabled student advisors also have very little awareness because until last week, nobody really knew what was going on. And importantly, for existing students, their current suppliers will likely leave. So one of the things that you need to be aware of as practitioners in the industry supporting disabled people, just be aware that DSA is being reformed. The Find Your Way guide online is updated to have the new reform info, but your disability advisors will be very, very stressed for the next 6 months. So being aware of some of the challenges that are going into the critical support functions that are going on in DSA is something that's important. And if you're sat there going, that's a bit of a mind mess because of all of this new information, booking a meeting with me or one of my colleagues in our DSA support team, and we are trying to build better awareness of the new system. And if we get DSA right, students can start right, they'll have less trouble later on, and they'll stay in education where we know financial well-being and a good financial future leads from achieving well in education. So I just wanted to finish on just that point because it's a terrifying little thing that's going on. but it should hopefully go well.